She had 61 years behind her and a cardboard box in front of her. Everything that remained of her marriage fit inside it: a ceramic mug, a phone charger, a pair of reading glasses with one bent arm. The divorce was final on a Tuesday. By Friday, the house was listed. By the following Monday, she had $1,100 in a checking account and no clear sense of what came next. Among the papers she sorted that week, she found a key. Small, brass, worn smooth at the teeth from decades of use. There was no label attached to it, no note explaining where it came from or what it opened. It had been in a tin box in the back of a closet she had never thought to open in 22 years of marriage. She set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up the name stamped into its bow: Eldon Holt, Culver's Crossing, Ohio, and she wrote the address in pencil on the back of an envelope. There are places that wait, not in any mystical sense, but in the plain and patient way that a building waits when no one has unlocked its door in 40 years. Dust settling in layers across the workbench, tools resting exactly where a pair of hands last set them down. A clock on the far wall still marking time because someone wound it carefully and the mechanism was built to last. Such places do not announce themselves. They simply endure, holding everything that was placed inside them until the right key finds the right lock. Her husband had taken the savings, the equity, the certainty of the next 10 years. What he had not known, what perhaps no one still living had known, was that a deed existed, drawn up 11 years before the marriage, with her name already written on it in an old man's careful hand. A small building on a gravel lane in a town of 340 people. One tin sign, one locked drawer, and a letter, sealed, waiting. Some inheritances move in straight lines, father to son, deed to deed, dollar to dollar. And some move the way time moves inside a watch, through a series of careful, hidden mechanisms, each one depending on the last, each one invisible until the case is opened and you see the whole of it turning. What Miriam Holt found in Culver's Crossing was not just a building, and not just money, and not just a letter written by a man she had never met. It was the remainder of a life lived quietly in service to others. And it had been waiting, with the patience of a well-wound clock, for exactly the right person to arrive. The box was a medium-sized cardboard produce carton that had once held canned tomatoes. Someone at the county clerk's office had written her name on the side in black marker, Miriam Holt, and underlined it once, as if to make sure she understood it still belonged to her. She carried it out to the parking lot under one arm, unlocked her car with the other hand, and set it on the passenger seat without looking inside. She drove to the motel on Route 41 and sat in the parking lot with the engine running for 4 minutes before she went in. The room cost $47 a night. It had a box heating unit under the window and a laminated card on the dresser listing checkout time as 11 in the morning. She set the carton on the second bed and finally looked at what was in it. There was the ceramic mug she had kept at her office desk for 9 years, the one with a small chip on the rim she had never had repaired. There was a phone charger, a pocket calendar from the previous year, a pair of reading glasses with the left arm bent slightly outward, and a manila envelope sealed with a strip of packing tape. She did not open the envelope that night. She set her glasses on top of it and went to bed at 8:15, and lay in the dark listening to trucks pass on the highway. The divorce had been filed in February and finalized on a Tuesday in late March. 22 years. She had been 39 when they married, and she was 61 now, and that arithmetic required no special thought to arrive at. The settlement left her with $1,140 in a personal checking account, the contents of her office, and no claim on the house, which had already been listed with a realtor in Columbus before the papers were signed. Her attorney, a tired man named Gerald, who charged $210 an hour, told her she could contest the asset disclosure. She asked him what that would cost. He paused before he answered. She told him to let it go. She had worked for 20 years as an office manager for a civil engineering firm. She was good at the work, organized, steady, reliable with numbers. But the firm had been bought out the previous autumn, and the new ownership had reduced the administrative staff. Her last day had been a Friday in November. She had received a severance of $3,200 and a card signed by 11 people, some of whose names she had to read twice because she had not known how to spell them. Since then, she had been living on that severance and on what remained of a small personal savings account her husband had not had access to. It was not much. It was something. On the third morning in the motel, she opened the manila envelope. Inside was a folded stack of papers held together with a binder clip, photocopies of financial statements, a quitclaim document for the house, a letter from her husband's attorney summarizing the terms. She read through them at the small table by the window with a gas station coffee and a styrofoam cup. At the bottom of the stack, loose, was a single index card with her handwriting on it. She did not remember writing it. It said only, "Check the tin box, hall closet, top shelf." She turned the card over. Nothing on the back. She had a key to the house until the end of April. She drove there on a Wednesday afternoon, let herself in through the side door, and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The rooms were clean and empty feeling, in the way that houses become when one person has already begun to absent themselves from the shared life. The hall closet still had her winter coats in it. She took those first, folded them over her arm, and carried them to the car. Then she went back for the tin box. It was a rectangular tin, the kind that had once held butter cookies, printed with a faded tartan pattern in red and green. It was on the top shelf behind a stack of folded paper bags, and she had to stand on her toes to reach it. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it to the kitchen counter and pried the lid off with the handle of a butter knife. Inside was a rubber-banded bundle of old Christmas cards, a spool of white thread, 2 Canadian quarters, a small pocket knife with a cracked handle, and a key. The key was brass, small, worn smooth at the teeth from long use. The bow was stamped with a name, Eldon Holt, Watchmaker, and below the name, in smaller letters, a street in town. 14 Birch Lane, Culver's Crossing, Ohio. She turned it over in her hand. The metal had a weight to it that felt deliberate, as if it had been made to last. She did not recognize the name Eldon Holt. She had never heard her husband mention anyone by that name, and she had never heard of Culver's Crossing. She set the key on the counter and went through the rest of the tin carefully, shaking out each Christmas card and running her thumb along the inside of the lid. There was nothing else. She stood at the counter for a time. Outside, a truck shifted gears on the street. The refrigerator, now empty, hummed against the far wall. Her husband had kept this key in this tin on this shelf for 22 years and had never once mentioned it. She could think of no innocent reason for that, and no clear guilty one either. She picked the key up and put it in her coat pocket, put the lid back on the tin, and left the tin on the counter for whoever came next. She took nothing else from the house except her coats and a cast-iron skillet she had bought herself the first winter of the marriage. Back at the motel, she looked up Culver's Crossing. It was a small township in Hardin County, population 340 according to the most recent available count, situated along State Route 37, where it intersected with County Road 7. There was no website for the town itself. There was a listing for a grain cooperative and a listing for a church, and a single result referencing a name in a county historical archive. Eldon Holt, Master Watchmaker, established 1961, Culver's Crossing. The archive page had not been updated since 2007. She wrote the address in pencil on the back of the manila envelope. She did not make any decision that night. She ate a sandwich from the gas station 2 doors down and watched the local weather forecast and went to bed early. But in the morning, before she had finished her coffee, she found herself looking at the key again, where she had left it on the nightstand. small and plain and worn, and she went to the bathroom and washed her face and put on her shoes. She had nowhere pressing to be. She had $1,123 and a tank of gas and a penciled address on the back of an envelope. She pulled the motel door shut behind her and listened to it latch, and she walked to the car in the cold morning air without looking back. She left the motel at 7:40 in the morning with a gas station coffee in the cup holder and the manila envelope on the passenger seat. The penciled address was face up. She had looked at a road atlas the night before, a spiral-bound Ohio atlas she had found in the glove compartment, 3 years old, and creased along the spine. And she had traced the route with her finger before she went to sleep. Interstate 71, north to State Route 37 west, then County Road 7, then Birch Lane if it appeared on the map at all. It did not. She had noted the approximate area and decided she would find it when she got there. The interstate was flat and wide and moved fast. She passed Columbus in the early light, the downtown buildings catching the first of the sun on their upper floors, while the streets below were still in shadow. She had worked in that city for 11 years. She had driven these same approaches hundreds of times, in both directions, at all hours, without giving them much thought. Now she watched the skyline pass in her side mirror and felt no particular pull toward it. The exit for her old office building came and went. She kept to the left lane and held 63 miles per hour and drank her coffee. State Route 37 began at a cloverleaf interchange with a BP station and a Waffle House on opposite corners, and then flattened out immediately into 2 lanes of blacktop running between fence rows and harvested cornfields. The land was level here, the kind of level that feels deliberate, as if the earth had been pressed smooth by something patient and enormous. The fields had been turned over for winter, dark brown furrows running in long parallel lines to the horizon. A grain elevator appeared in the distance, its white concrete cylinders bright against the gray sky, and then passed. There were no other landmarks for several miles. She had grown up in a small town herself, though not as small as Culver's Crossing. Her parents had kept a house on a county road outside of Zanesville, and she had spent her childhood in the particular way of rural children, with long, slow summers and a detailed knowledge of a very small area. She had left at 18 for Columbus, and she had not lived rurally since. But the sight of turned fields and fence rows and grain elevators did not feel foreign to her. It felt more like a language she had once spoken fluently and then set aside for years, and now found she could still mostly read. At Kenton, she stopped for gas and used the restroom and bought a second coffee and a packet of peanut butter crackers. The woman at the register had the radio on. A farm report, commodity prices read in a flat measured voice. Miriam paid $4.11 and stood by the car for a moment in the cold air before getting back in. The sky had gone a uniform pale gray. It was not threatening weather, just the settled overcast of a late winter Ohio morning, the kind that sits and does not move. She pulled back onto the highway and ate the crackers one at a time. County Road 7 appeared without ceremony, a green sign on a metal post, slightly tilted, the reflective lettering still readable but faded to a dull silver. She turned left and the road changed immediately. It was paved but barely. The asphalt narrowed to a single wide lane with gravel shoulders and patches of frost heave that had lifted sections of the surface into low ridges. She slowed to 40, then 35. The fields gave way to woodlots, second-growth timber, beech and ash and box elder, their bare branches lacing together overhead in a way that dimmed the already flat light. The road curved. The world got smaller. She crossed a one-lane bridge over a creek she could not see the bottom of and felt the planks flex slightly under the tires. Not enough to alarm, but enough to notice. On the far side, a hand-lettered sign on a fence post read, "Culver's Crossing, 2 miles." Below it, someone had added in a different hand and older paint, unincorporated. She kept her speed at 30 and watched the road. There was a washed-out culvert a half-mile further on where the gravel shoulder had caved, and the edge of the pavement crumbled away into a shallow ditch. She eased left to avoid it and felt the rear tires find soft ground for a moment before the road firmed back up. She stopped the car and looked back at the gap in the shoulder. It was passable, but only just. She sat with the engine running and both hands on the wheel and thought about turning around. Then she put the car in drive and went on. Culver's Crossing appeared the way very small towns appear on county roads. Not all at once, but in pieces. First, a farmhouse set back from the road with a rusted propane tank beside the porch. Then a cluster of mailboxes at a gravel intersection. Then a water tower on a low rise to the north, painted white, with the township name in faded blue letters. Then a short main street of perhaps 8 or 10 buildings, some of them occupied and some of them not. All of them wood-framed and of a similar age. Late 1940s or early 50s, she guessed, built in the brief window of post-war confidence before the smaller towns began their long, quiet recession. A barber shop with a real pole, still turning. A farm co-op with a pickup truck parked sideways out front. A diner with a handwritten hours sign taped inside the glass door. She drove the length of the main street slowly. It took less than a minute. At the far end, where the road bent back toward the fields, she found Birch Lane. Not a lane, really. More a wide gravel track running alongside a row of mature birch trees, their white bark peeling in long, papery strips. She turned in and drove at a walking pace over the loose stone, the car rocking slightly in the ruts. There were 2 buildings on the lane. The first was a small frame house, tidy, with a storm door and a wood pile under a tarp. The second, set slightly back and separated from the house by a gap of maybe 30 feet, was a narrow commercial storefront. Single-story, wood-sided, the front windows painted over from the inside with white latex that had gone yellow at the edges. She stopped the car and looked at it. Above the door, mounted on a rusted iron bracket, was a tin sign. The letters on it were raised and painted in a dark green that had mostly oxidized to gray. Holt's Watch Repair. Beneath the name, in smaller letters, Est, 1961. One of the bracket bolts had worked loose and the sign hung at a slight angle, so the words ran slightly downhill from left to right. The door was solid wood, painted dark red once, now weathered to a flat and dusty pink. At its center, where a knob would normally be, was a brass keyhole plate, tarnished, nearly black. She turned off the engine. She sat for a moment in the sudden quiet. Then she reached for the key. The key fit. Not smoothly. There was resistance, the kind that comes from a lock that has not been turned in years, the pins seized with dust and the faint corrosion of long stillness. She applied pressure and felt nothing give. She tried again, gentler this time, working the key back and forth by small degrees the way she had once seen a locksmith do on a stuck deadbolt. And on the 4th try the cylinder turned with a grinding reluctance, and the bolt drew back and the door swung inward on its own weight, slowly, as if it had been waiting for the pressure to release. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted. Dust, yes, and the particular dryness of a closed space. But beneath that something else, something she could not name immediately. Oil, metal, the faint sweetness of old wood. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of a place that had once been used carefully and then sealed against the weather and left intact. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes find the shapes in the dimness. The painted windows admitted almost no light. What came in came from behind her, and it fell across the floor in a pale rectangle and illuminated a layer of fine gray dust on the wooden floorboards that was so even and unbroken, it looked almost deliberate. She stepped inside and left the door open behind her. The room was narrow, perhaps 14 feet wide. and ran back maybe 30 feet to a doorway hung with a canvas curtain, faded to a uniform gray tan. To her left was a long wooden counter, waist-high, with a glass top that was filmed with dust, but otherwise intact. Behind the counter, shelves ran floor to ceiling, built from the same dark-stained pine as the counter itself, fitted with dovetail joints at the corners, so precise she could see them clearly, even through the dust. On the shelves were clocks, dozens of them, mantel clocks and bracket clocks and a few small carriage clocks and one long case movement without its housing, its brass gears visible, sitting on a folded shop cloth. They were all stopped. All of them, as far as she could tell, read different times, a frozen discord of hours that gave the room a strange, suspended quality, as if each clock had stopped at its own private moment. To her right was the workbench. It ran the full width of the room and was bolted to the wall with 4-inch lag screws she could see from where she stood. The surface was covered in a fitted sheet of dark green linoleum, worn through in 2 oval patches where hands had rested for years. The tools were laid out across it, not scattered, not abandoned. Laid out. A watchmaker's loop on a folded chamois cloth, a set of screwdrivers in graduated sizes in a slotted wooden holder, smallest to largest, left to right. A pair of tweezers, tips together, resting on the chamois beside the loop. A mainspring winder, a case knife, a small ultrasonic cleaning tank, unplugged, its cord coiled and tied with a twist of wire. Everything in its place, everything precisely where it should be. She had the clear and unsettling sense that the person who had laid these tools out had intended to return and had not. She walked to the workbench and stood before it without touching anything. The dust on the linoleum surface was the same even layer as the floor, undisturbed for years, perhaps decades. She looked at the screwdrivers. The handles were dark wood, hexagonal, with a brass collar at the base of each blade. The smallest blade was perhaps a millimeter wide. She had never worked on a watch in her life. She did not know what most of these tools were for. She stood there for a moment and then moved on. The ledger was on the end of the counter nearest the door, lying flat, its cover dark green with a cloth spine reinforced with black tape at the corners. She opened it carefully. The pages were thin and had gone the color of weak tea at the edges, but the writing on them was clear. A small, even hand in black ink. The letters formed with the careful regularity of someone who had learned penmanship in an era when penmanship was graded. Each entry had a date, a customer name, a brief description of the work, and a dollar amount. The first entry was dated March the 14th, 1961. The last entry she could find, toward the back, was dated September the 2nd, 1997. 36 years of work recorded in this one book, in this one hand, in this one room. She turned pages without reading each entry. Names repeated, the same families appearing year after year, generation after generation. Certain amounts appeared often, $4, $7, $12. Some entries had a small notation beside the dollar amount, a single asterisk, or the word PD in pencil, as if added later. She did not yet know what the asterisk meant. She closed the ledger gently and set it back where she had found it. The locked drawer was in the center section of the workbench, below the linoleum surface, fitted with a small brass lock plate that matched the one on the front door. The keyhole was the same size and shape. She tried the key. It did not turn. This lock was different. The key entered, but the profile did not match. She tried both ways. Nothing. She stood back and looked at the drawer front. It was a full-width drawer, perhaps 18 inches across and 4 inches tall, with a simple wooden pull. She pressed on the pull without expecting anything, and felt only the solid resistance of a locked mechanism. She would need something else. She would deal with it later. She walked to the back of the room and pushed through the canvas curtain. Behind it was a small room that had served as a combination office and storage area, a wooden desk, a tilting office chair with a cracked leather seat, a single metal filing cabinet, and along the back wall, stacked wooden crates labeled in marker. Movements, cases, miscase parts. A small window high in the back wall admitted a thin rectangle of gray light. Beneath the window was a cot, folded flat, with a wool blanket still on it, folded in thirds. She looked at the cot for a long moment. Then she went back through the curtain into the main room. She was standing near the center of the shop, looking at the shelves of stopped clocks, when she heard it. Faint. Very faint, but unmistakable in the silence of the room. A tick. She turned toward the sound. It was coming from the far end of the highest shelf, from a small bracket clock with a dark walnut case and a cream-colored dial, its hands showing 10 minutes past 4. She watched it for a moment. The second hand moved. It was running. 40 years of dust on every surface around it. Every other clock in the room stopped at its own private hour, and this one still keeping time. She did not know who had wound it last or how long ago, but the movement was steady and even, the tick small and clear in the stillness. She stood and listened to it for a while. Then she went back outside to get her coat. She locked the shop door behind her and stood on the gravel for a moment, orienting herself. The birch trees ran in a line to her left, their white trunks catching what pale light the overcast allowed. The small frame house next door had a wind chime on the porch that turned without sound in the cold air. She could see it moving, but could not hear it. The main street was 2 short blocks north, back the way she had come. She had seen a hardware store from the car, or what she had taken for one, on the east side of the street near the grain co-op. She pulled her coat closed and started walking. The cold was dry and still, the kind that settles in flat country when there is no wind to move it along. Her breath showed in front of her. The gravel of Birch Lane crunched under her shoes. She had worn the wrong shoes for this, low leather flats she had put on out of habit, and they were thin-soled against the cold ground. She kept her hands in her coat pockets and walked at a steady pace. A dog in the yard of a house she passed lifted its head and watched her without barking. Somewhere a tractor engine idled, far off, just audible. The sound of a town at low volume, running on its own rhythms, indifferent to the stranger walking its edges. Dillard's Hardware occupied a narrow storefront between an insurance office that appeared to be closed for good and a barber shop whose pole still turned in a small electric motor's slow rotation. The hardware store window held a hand-lettered paper sign listing propane exchange prices and a display of mouse traps and weather stripping and boxes of sheet metal screws arranged without apparent system. A bell mounted on a spring above the door rang when she pushed it open. The smell inside was immediate and specific, lubricating oil and sawdust, and the dry mineral smell of bagged concrete, undercut by something warmer, like a wood stove somewhere in the back. The stove was there, as it turned out, a small cast-iron box stove in the rear left corner, its pipe running up through a sheet metal collar in the ceiling, a split log burning behind its glass door. The store was narrow and long, with wooden shelving running floor to ceiling on both walls, stocked in a dense and personal order that made sense only to someone who had spent years learning it. She saw pipe fittings and caulk and rolls of Romex electrical cable, and boxes of 16-penny nails and drawer pulls and rolls of screen mesh and sandpaper in graduated grits, all of it labeled by hand on small cards tucked into the shelf edge. A man stood behind a wooden counter at the back, writing something in a spiral notebook. He was old, 74, she would later learn, with close-cut white hair and the broad hands of someone who had spent most of his life working with them. He looked up when she came in and nodded once. She told him what she needed. A pry bar, she said, something small. And sandpaper, medium grit. She was not sure she needed the sandpaper, but she felt she should have a reason for the pry bar that she could state plainly. And sanding the window frames had come to mind. The man, His name was Walt Dillard, though she did not know that yet, set down his pen and came around the counter without hurrying. He led her to the middle of the left-hand wall and pointed to a row of pry bars hanging on a pegboard. There were 4 sizes. He took down the middle one, a 14-inch flat bar with a beveled tip and a nail slot, and handed it to her. She turned it in her hands. The steel was cold and solid, the finish matte black. It felt like the right thing. He was reaching for the sandpaper, a sleeve of assorted grits on the shelf below, when he stopped. He had seen the key. It was hanging from the carabiner clip on her bag strap where she had put it that morning to keep from losing it. The brass bow turned outward, the stamped lettering facing up. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the key, the way a person looks at something they recognize from a long time ago, something they had not expected to see again. Then he looked at her. "That's Eldon's key," he said. She said that she believed it was. She told him her name. She told him she had driven from Columbus that morning. She did not tell him about the divorce or the motel or the $1,100, but she told him about the tin box and the address and the deed she had not yet found but suspected existed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, his hands resting on the shelf edge. Then he said, "He was a good man. Kept to himself, but good." She said she had not known him. Walt nodded as if this did not surprise him. He went to the back of the store without explaining himself and came back with a small hand lamp, a compact LED work light with a magnetic base and a fold-out hook at the top, and a tube of penetrating oil, the kind used to free corroded fasteners. He set them on the counter beside the pry bar. She looked at the items and then at him. He said the lamp would be useful if the power was off in the building, which it probably was, and the penetrating oil would help with any locks or hinges that had seized up, which they probably had. She understood that he knew the shop, had been inside it, had his own set of impressions of the place and the man who had kept it. She did not ask how well he had known Eldon Holt. It did not seem like the right moment. She put the pry bar and the sandpaper and the penetrating oil on the counter and reached for her wallet. The lamp was still off to the side. She assumed it was for sale. She asked him what she owed. He wrote on a small paper slip, the pry bar at $6, the sandpaper at $2, and pushed the slip across the counter, $8 total. She set a 10 on the counter and told him to keep the change. He put the 10 in the register and gave her $2 bills back without comment. She left them on the counter. He looked at them and then put them in a small ceramic dish beside the register that held a few other folded bills. She picked up the bag with the pry bar and the sandpaper and the oil. The lamp was still on the counter. She reached for it and he shook his head slightly. "Take it," he said. "Eldon would have wanted that place opened, right?" She looked at him. He had already turned back toward his notebook. She put the lamp in the bag. The bell rang when she opened the door and rang again when it swung shut behind her. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold air and shifted the bag to her other hand. The hardware store window reflected her own shape back at her, indistinct in the painted glass. She turned and started back toward Birch Lane. She let herself back into the shop and propped the door open with a brick she found beside the stoop, flat, old, worn smooth at the corners, left there as if for exactly this purpose. The cold came in with her, but the light came in too, a pale winter rectangle that fell across the floor and reached the base of the workbench. She hung the hand lamp from its fold-out hook on the edge of the upper shelf and switched it on. The LED light was sharp and clean and changed the room entirely, pulling detail out of the dimness, the grain of the pine shelving, the tarnish patterns on the clock cases, the 2 worn ovals on the workbench linoleum that she could now see had been shaped precisely by years of forearms resting in the same position, day after day, doing close work. She set the penetrating oil in the pry bar on the near end of the counter and looked at the locked drawer. In the better light, she could see it more clearly. The drawer front was fitted flush with the workbench frame, no gap at the top or sides, jointed with the same precision as the shelving. The brass lock plate was small, perhaps an inch square, centered in the drawer front, its keyhole slot vertical. The wooden pull was a simple turned knob, dark with the oil of long handling. She studied the lock plate for a moment, then uncapped the penetrating oil and worked the thin straw applicator into the keyhole slot and pressed the nozzle twice. The oil went in dark amber and ran down the inside of the plate, and she could smell it immediately, sharp and mineral, cutting through the dust smell of the room. She waited. The instructions on the tube said to allow 5 to 10 minutes for the penetrant to work into the mechanism. She used the time to move through the shop slowly, the hand lamp casting its clean light ahead of her. She opened the canvas curtain to the back room and set the lamp on the desk and went through the filing cabinet. 3 drawers, unlocked. The top drawer held hanging files, paper-clipped and labeled in the same small hand as the ledger. Tax records going back to 1963. Supplier invoices, a folder labeled correspondence that held perhaps 40 letters in their original envelopes, all addressed to Eldon Holt at this address. The middle drawer held spare parts, small labeled envelopes of watch components, mainsprings coiled in glassine sleeves, a set of balance staffs in graduated sizes in a wooden tray, a dozen or more crown wheels wrapped individually in tissue. The bottom drawer held tools she did not recognize and 2 Watchmaker's catalogs from the 1980s, their covers soft with handling. She left the files in order and went back to the main room. 8 minutes had passed. She picked up the thin blade screwdriver she had noticed among the tools on the workbench. A flathead, the blade perhaps 2 millimeters wide, the wooden handle dark and smooth, and worked it into the keyhole slot at an angle, applying light rotational pressure while she pulled the drawer pull with her other hand. The mechanism resisted. She held the pressure steady, not forcing it, letting the penetrant do its work. And after a moment, she felt something shift. Not fully, not yet, but a small internal movement, a pin dropping a fraction of a millimeter. She stopped and applied 2 more drops of oil and waited another 3 minutes. The second attempt was the same as the first for a long moment. Then the cylinder turned. It went with a grinding reluctance, and then a soft click that she felt more than heard. A small, clean mechanical release, and the drawer came forward half an inch on its own and stopped. She set the screwdriver down and pulled the drawer open the rest of the way by the knob. It ran on wooden slides, smooth despite the years, and came fully open without catching. She stood looking at what was inside. The money was banded with a strip of paper tape, handwritten 2340. The bills were mixed, 20s and 10s and a few 5s, and they were old, the paper soft and slightly waxy in the way of currency that has been handled and stored for a long time. She did not touch them immediately. Beside the money was a rolled document tied with a length of cotton kitchen twine, the paper yellowed and stiff at the edges. And beside the document, lying flat, was a sealed envelope of the kind used for personal correspondence, cream-colored, letter-sized, the flap sealed and reinforced with a strip of clear tape that had gone brittle with age. On the front, in the same small, careful hand as the ledger entries, was written, "For whoever holds the key." She picked up the rolled document first. She worked the twine loose. It was knotted simply, a bowline, and came undone with one pull, and unrolled the paper on the counter, holding the corners flat with the pry bar and the penetrating oil tube. It was a deed, Hardin County, State of Ohio. The property described was the lot at 14 Birch Lane, Culver's Crossing, together with the commercial structure thereon. The grantor line was blank. The grantee line read, Miriam Elaine Hargrove, her name before the marriage. The deed was dated November the 9th, 1988. She had been 18 years old in 1988. She had never heard of Eldon Holt in 1988. She had not met her husband until 2001. She stood looking at her own name on the document and said nothing. She set the deed flat and picked up the money and counted it. $2,340. The bills were legal tender, old series, but valid. She counted twice to be sure. She banded it again with the paper tape and set it beside the deed. Then she looked at the envelope. The tape on the flap had dried to a near-brittle seal but held. She did not open it yet. She was not ready to open it yet, and she knew it, and she allowed herself that. She pressed both palms flat on the counter and looked at the three objects arranged in front of her: the money, the deed, the sealed envelope. And she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, slowly, the way she had learned to do in a difficult year a long time ago. She picked up the envelope and held it. It was light. A single sheet inside, maybe two. The handwriting on the front was unhurried and even. The letters formed with the same patience as every other piece of writing she had seen in this building. She turned it over. The back was blank. She set it on top of the deed and gathered both the deed and the envelope and held them against her chest with both arms crossed over them, standing in the light of the hand lamp with the cold coming in through the prop door and the one running clock ticking on the high shelf. And she stood that way for a while before she did anything else. She sat in the tilting office chair in the back room with the hand lamp set on the desk beside her. The wool blanket from the cot was across her lap. She had unfolded it without thinking about it, needing something against the cold that had settled into the building through the open door. The envelope was in her hands. She worked the brittle tape loose with her thumbnail, slowly, not tearing the paper, and opened the flap and drew out a single, folded sheet of cream-colored stationery. The paper was heavier than she expected, the good kind, the kind bought from a proper stationer and kept in a box. She unfolded it. The handwriting covered both sides, front and back. The same small, careful hand she had come to recognize, but slightly different here. More deliberate, the letters formed with the particular attention of someone writing something they intended to last. She read it aloud, quietly, to the empty room. March the 3rd, 1987. To whoever holds the key, I expect I won't know you. That is all right. Most of the things worth doing in a life are done for people you will never meet, and I have made my peace with that. My name is Eldon Ray Holt. I was born in Kenton, Ohio in 1922, the second of 4 children. I learned watchmaking from my father, who learned it from his, and I have practiced the trade in this building since March of 1961, which means 26 years as of this writing, and I intend to practice it until I cannot. I am 65 years old. My hands are still steady. That is what matters in this work. I never married. I want to say that plainly and without apology. It was not the life I was built for, and I knew it early enough to spare anyone the trouble of finding it out later. I have no children that I know of, and no close family remaining. My sister Ruth passed in '79. My brother Dale is in a facility in Lima that I visit when I can, though he no longer knows me when I come. There is no one to leave this building to in the ordinary way. That is why I am writing this letter, and why I am putting it in the drawer with the deed, and whatever I have managed to set aside by the time you read this. The deed I had drawn up is made out in a name I was given by a woman named Clara Hargrove, who came into this shop in the autumn of 1986 with a pocket watch that had belonged to her husband and a problem she did not know how to carry. The watch I fixed in an afternoon. The problem took longer to understand. She had a daughter, she told me, 18 years old, who was going to need something solid to stand on someday. She did not say why she believed that. I did not ask. I have found that people say what they need to say when they are ready to say it, and not before. And my job in this life has mostly been to do good work and wait. Clara came back twice more that winter, and by the 3rd visit I understood enough. The daughter's name was Miriam Elaine Hargrove. I wrote it on the deed, and I had the deed witnessed by Walt Dillard at the hardware store, who is a good man and keeps his own counsel, and I put it in the drawer, and I did not tell Clara, because I did not want her to feel she owed me anything. I left it for time to work out. I do not know what your circumstances are as you read this. I hope they are good. If they are not, I hope this building is useful to you. The structure is sound. I have maintained it myself, replaced the roof in '74, and repointed the foundation in '81 and rewired the whole of it to code in '83. All the work done by my own hand, or with Walt's help, on the heavy parts. The shelving is quarter-sawn white oak and will outlast both of us. The tools on the bench are good tools, bought right and cared for. The clocks on the shelves belong to no one now. Some were left for repair and never collected. Some I bought at estate sales over the years because I could not stand to see a good movement go to waste. Do with them what seems right. I want to say something about the work itself, because I think it matters and I am not sure anyone has said it to you before. Watchmaking is not about watches. It is about the idea that small things, fitted together with care and patience, can keep time against all the forces that would rather they did not. Every movement that comes to this bench is broken in a specific way, and the job is to find that specific way and correct it, not to replace the whole, not to start over, but to understand exactly what failed and why, and to make it right. I have found this to be a useful way to think about most things. I offer it in case it is useful to you. The money in the drawer is what I have been able to put by over the past several years above what I need for the shop and my own modest living. I add to it when I can. I do not know what the total will be when you read this. That depends on when you read it and what the years between have looked like. Take it without guilt. It was set aside for exactly this purpose. There is one instruction. The bracket clock on the top shelf, far right end, walnut case with a cream dial. I have kept it wound. It is a Seth Thomas movement, 1891. As good a piece of American clockmaking as I have ever handled. I wound it for the last time on the morning I write this, and I do not know how much longer it will run before someone winds it again. If it is still running when you find it, wind it and keep it running. If it has stopped, start it again. It is the only clock in this room that I ask you to keep. The rest you may do with as you see fit. I do not know your name as I write this, and I will not know it when you read this. And that is the nature of certain kinds of giving. They move in one direction only and ask nothing back. But I will say this. Clara Hargrove sat in that chair where I expect you are sitting now, in the winter of 1986. And she told me that her daughter was going to need something solid to stand on someday. I believed her. I still believe her. I hope I'm right. Take care of the tools. Win the clock. Do good work. Yours sincerely, Eldon Ray Holt. Culver's Crossing, Ohio, March the 3rd, 1987. Miriam read it through once without stopping. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands, and sat for a long time in the tilting chair with the wool blanket across her lap, and the hand lamp burning beside her, and the distant tick of the Seth Thomas clock coming through the canvas curtain from the room beyond. She did not wipe her face. She did not move for a while. Outside, the overcast had begun to thin at the western edge, and a pale winter light was finding its way down Birch Lane through the birch trees, and it reached the propped-open door of the shop and lay across the floor in a long, quiet stripe. She had been back 3 times since that first day. Each visit she stayed a little longer, swept a little more, opened a window in the back room to let the stale air move. She had found a broom behind the filing cabinet and used it until the floorboards were clear enough to see their grain. Wide plank white oak, the same as the shelving, darkened with decades of foot traffic in 2 worn paths. One from the door to the counter, one from the counter to the workbench. She had wound the Seth Thomas clock on the second visit, pulling the 2 winding arbors gently with the correct key, which she had found hanging on a small nail inside the back room door. The clock did not falter. It took the winding and continued without interruption, the tick steady and unhurried, the way a thing sounds when it was built right and has been maintained right, and asks nothing extraordinary of the person tending it. She had moved back into the motel on Route 41. It was not a plan so much as a continuation of the only momentum she had. She paid for a week at a time, $47 a night, $329 for 7 nights. And she set the deed and the letter in the nightstand drawer each evening and took them out each morning to look at them, the way she might have looked at a map to confirm she was still on the right road. She had found a county attorney listed in Kenton, a 40-minute drive, and had called and left a message explaining the deed and asking about title verification. The office had not yet returned the call. She was not alarmed. Things moved at their own pace out here. She was learning to match it. He arrived on a Thursday. She was at the workbench with the hand lamp on and the door propped open, working through the shelves systematically, lifting each clock down and setting it on the counter and noting its condition in a spiral notebook she had bought at the gas station. She had no system for what came next. She was simply making an inventory, the way she would have approached any complex situation in her previous working life. Start with what you know and build from there. She heard gravel crunch under tires on Birch Lane and looked up. A silver sedan, clean and recently washed, came slowly up the track and stopped in front of the shop. The driver sat inside for a moment before getting out. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed for a county road. A gray wool topcoat, pressed dark trousers, shoes that had not been bought for walking on gravel. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with the particular ease of someone accustomed to having his presence taken seriously. He came to the open door and stopped at the threshold without stepping inside, which she noted. He looked around the interior of the shop with the brief, calibrating look of a man doing arithmetic in his head. Then he looked at her. He said his name was Gary Prentice, that he was with a development group based in Columbus, and that he had been aware of this property for some time. He said it pleasantly, in a moderate and reasonable tone, as if he were delivering information she would find useful. She set her notebook on the counter and waited. She had dealt with men like this before, not developers specifically, but men of this particular ease, men who opened conversations with their credentials rather than their purposes, and who phrased things as information when they were in fact proposals. She had learned in 20 years of office management that the correct response to such openings was patience. She did not fill the silence. He came to it himself within a few seconds, which told her something. He said he understood the property had recently come into new hands. He said he wanted to be straightforward with her. He always said that, she suspected, and she noted the word as one notes a tell in a card game. His group was prepared to offer $41,000 for the building and the lot, as is, including contents. He said this was a fair number for a commercial structure of this age and condition in an unincorporated township, and he said it in a way that suggested she might not know what was fair, and he was doing her the service of informing her. He added after a brief pause that the county zoning board met on Thursday of the following week, and that there were certain reclassification measures on the agenda that could affect property values in this corridor. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. She looked at him for a moment after he finished. The shop was quiet except for the clock on the high shelf, marking its small, steady intervals. She thought about $41,000, and she thought about $1,123 in a checking account. And she thought about a deed drawn up in 1988 with her name on it in an old man's careful hand. And she thought about the word someday in a letter written to no one in particular and left in a locked drawer for 36 years. She thought about all of this quickly and without drama, the way she processed most things. And then she looked back at the man in the gray topcoat. She said she was not in a position to make any decisions at this time. She said it evenly, without apology. He nodded as if he had expected this, as if it were the first move in a negotiation rather than an answer. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a business card, cream-colored, engraved, his name and a Columbus phone number. and set it on the counter near the door. He said she should take her time, that his group was patient, and that the offer would remain open through the end of the month. He smiled when he said it, a brief and practiced smile that did not reach much. Then he looked once more around the shop, at the shelves of clocks, at the workbench, at the hand lamp burning on its hook. And he said it was a lot of work to take on, for one person, in a building this age. He said it as observation. It landed as something else. She did not answer that. She pressed the rolled deed against her chest with both arms crossed over it and looked at him and said nothing. He took the silence for what it was, or close enough, and said good afternoon and went back down the gravel track to his clean silver car and drove away without hurrying. The sound of his tires on the gravel faded, and then the lane was quiet again. Just the birch trees and the cold air and the clock on the shelf. She stood for a moment after he left, her arms still crossed, the deed still pressed against her coat. Then she looked at the business card on the counter. She did not pick it up. She turned back to her notebook and found her place in the inventory and kept on. She was at the workbench the next morning when she heard footsteps on the gravel. Not a car this time. Feet moving at a steady walking pace up the lane. She looked up from the inventory notebook and saw a woman in a dark coat come through the open door without knocking, which surprised her, and then stop just inside the threshold and look around the shop with the unhurried recognition of someone returning to a place they know. The woman was perhaps 55, compact and direct in her movements, with short gray hair and the kind of face that had decided long ago not to waste effort on expressions it did not mean. She introduced herself as Diane Marsh. She said she was an attorney. She said Walt Dillard had mentioned the situation and she had thought it worth a visit. Miriam set down her pen. She said she had not asked for an attorney. Diane said she knew that. She said she was not there because she had been asked. She set a leather satchel on the counter and opened it and took out a legal pad and a pen and looked at Miriam with the patient and slightly appraising look of a person who has made a career of sizing up situations quickly and has gotten good at it. She asked to see the deed. Miriam looked at her for a moment, then went to the back room and got the deed from her bag and brought it out and unrolled it on the counter. Diane read it without touching it, leaning over it with her hands clasped behind her back. She was quiet for a full minute. Then she straightened up and said the deed was properly executed and witnessed, and that the title appeared clear, and that any zoning reclassification attempt affecting a legitimately deeded private property would face a substantial procedural burden. She said all of this in the same even tone one might use to discuss the weather. Then she said her flat fee for handling the matter through resolution would be $300. Miriam asked her why. Diane picked up her pen and wrote something on the legal pad. She said Eldon Holt had fixed her grandmother's anniversary clock in 1978 and had refused payment. Because, he said, the movement was interesting, and he had enjoyed the work. She said her grandmother had talked about it for years afterward. She said $300 seemed like a reasonable accounting. Miriam looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "All right." Diane nodded once, as if a minor administrative matter had been resolved, and uncapped her pen and began writing in earnest. They were still at the counter an hour later when the next person appeared. A man this time, older, in canvas work clothes and a wool cap, standing in the doorway with a jar of something in each hand. Preserves, it turned out, 2 jars of apple butter, one with a handwritten label dated the previous September. He said his name was Roy Callender, and he farmed the land on the north side of County Road 7, and he had known Eldon for 40 years. He said he had heard the shop was open again, and he had wanted to come by. He set the jars on the counter carefully, as if placing something of value, and he stood with his cap in his hands and looked around the room for a moment without speaking. Then he said that in the winter of 1989 his tractor had thrown a rod, and he had not had the money to fix it before spring planting, and Eldon had walked over one February morning and handed him an envelope with $420 in it and told him it was a loan and that Roy could pay it back when he was able and not before. Roy said he had paid it back in installments over 2 years. He said Eldon had recorded every payment in a small notebook and crossed each one off in pencil and handed the notebook to Roy when the last payment was made, open to the page, so Roy could see his own name with a clean line drawn through it. He said Eldon never mentioned it again after that. More came as the morning went on. Not a crowd. This was not that kind of town, but a steady procession of ones and twos, arriving on foot or by truck, stopping in the open doorway or stepping just inside, each of them bringing something small. A plate of cornbread wrapped in foil, a quart of soup in a mason jar, a paper bag of apples from cold storage, and with each one came a piece of a story. A woman named Helen Voss, who ran the diner, said Eldon had paid the electric bill for an elderly neighbor 3 winters running, anonymously, through the utility company. And she only knew because she had asked the utility office about her own billing once, and the clerk had mentioned it by accident. A man named Curtis, who repaired farm equipment on Route 37, said Eldon had spent 2 Saturdays helping him rewire his shop after a fire, refusing wages, saying only that Curtis made the best coffee in Hardin County, and that was payment enough. Diane wrote names and notes on her legal pad without comment. Miriam stood at the counter and listened to each person and thanked them and accepted what they brought, setting it all along the back edge of the counter in a quiet accumulation. She did not know what to do with most of it in any practical sense, but she understood what it meant. She was receiving a portrait assembled from many small pieces by people who had carried those pieces for years without being asked to account for them. Eldon Holt had lived in this building and on this lane for 36 years and had left almost no public record of himself. And yet the record existed, distributed among the memories of 340 people in an unincorporated township in Hardin County, Ohio, waiting to be assembled. By noon, Diane had enough. She capped her pen and put the legal pad back in the satchel and told Miriam she would file the necessary responses with the county that afternoon and that the zoning board meeting the following Thursday would find no action possible against this property. She said the deed was clean and the title was clear, and that Gary Prentice and his development group were entitled to make offers on whatever properties they wished, and that was the full extent of their entitlement. She snapped the satchel shut. She shook Miriam's hand with a firm, brief grip and walked back down Birch Lane without ceremony. Prentice did not return. He did not call. His business card sat on the counter for 3 more days before Miriam picked it up, looked at it once, and put it in the small bin she had set up near the door for paper waste. She did not do it with any drama. She just put it in the bin and went back to what she had been doing. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at the motel addressed to her, forwarded from the county assessor's office, which she had notified of the deed transfer. It was from a law firm in Columbus, a single paragraph stating that their client had withdrawn his interest in the Birch Lane property and wished her well in her endeavors. She read it once and set it on the nightstand beside the lamp. She had already spent most of that week at the shop, arriving before 8 and leaving after dark, working through the inventory and cleaning the clock cases one at a time with a soft cloth and a bottle of brass polish she had bought at Dillard's for $3.50. Walt had not commented on the situation with Prentice. He had rung up the brass polish and put it in a small paper bag and said the weather was supposed to break by the weekend. She had said she hoped so. That had been the whole of it, and it had been enough. 3 months is not long enough to learn watchmaking. She knew that. She was not trying to learn watchmaking in 3 months. She was trying to learn one thing at a time, in the way Eldon's letter had suggested, without quite saying it. Find what failed, understand why, correct it, not replace the whole. She had started with the catalogs in the filing cabinet, reading them in the evenings at the motel with a cup of gas station coffee, learning the names of parts and their functions the way she had once learned the terminology of civil engineering contracts, methodically, without urgency, building a vocabulary before attempting to use it, Then she had moved to a watchmaker's handbook she had found at a used bookstore in Kenton, 60 cents, its spine held together with a rubber band. Then to the movements themselves, the simplest ones first. Walt had helped in the way that Walt helped with things, which was to say, he offered exactly what was needed and did not offer more. He had come by the shop on a Saturday in April with a pocket watch of his own, a Waltham 17 jewels. The movement seized from a mainspring that had let go and left a coil jammed against the barrel wall. He set it on the workbench and stood back and said nothing. She understood. She worked the case open with the case knife, the way she had practiced on 3 other movements that week, and laid the parts out on the chamois cloth in the order of removal. It took her 40 minutes to clear the broken mainspring and another 20 to fit the replacement from the small labeled envelopes in the filing cabinet drawer. She wound the movement by hand and listened. It ticked. Walt picked it up and held it to his ear and set it back down. He said she had seated the click spring a little shallow on the left side. She looked where he pointed. She corrected it. He picked the movement up again and listened again and nodded once, which she had learned was the equivalent of high praise. She had moved out of the motel in late April. The small house next door to the shop, the tidy frame house with the storm door and the wood pile under a tarp, had turned out to belong to the same lot as the shop building, a fact the deed described in a subordinate clause she had not initially parsed. It was uninhabited, had been for some years, but it was structurally sound. The roof new within the decade, the plumbing intact, the electrical panel updated and grounded. She had gone through it room by room with the hand lamp and found nothing alarming. She had paid a Kenton plumber $60 to inspect the pipes and turn the water on, and she had paid Walt $4.30 for a new washer on the kitchen faucet, which she installed herself with a crescent wrench from Eldon's tool bench. Her first night in the house, she had slept on the folded cot from the shop's back room, on the floor of what would become the bedroom, with the wool blanket over her and the window cracked an inch. She had slept better than she had in months. By June, the shop had a shape to it that felt like intention rather than inheritance. She had cleaned every clock on the shelves and wound the ones whose mechanisms allowed it and tagged the others with small paper labels, noting what they needed. She had sold 4 of the stopped mantel clocks to a dealer in Findlay who drove out on a Wednesday and spent 2 hours going through the inventory and paid her $680 for the 4 pieces without negotiating, which told her she had priced them too low and that she would know better next time. She had used 200 of that to buy a proper mainspring assortment from a horological supplier in Pennsylvania, a flat tin with 48 labeled compartments, each holding a coiled mainspring and a glassine sleeve, and the rest she had put toward the house utilities and a month's worth of groceries from the co-op on the main street. She was at the workbench on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of June when the young woman appeared. The shop door was open. She left it open most days now, weather allowing, both for the light and because it seemed right, the way a shop door should be. The young woman was perhaps 25, slight, in a canvas jacket with the collar turned up. She was carrying a small anniversary clock in both hands, the kind with a glass dome and a rotating pendulum, holding it level and careful the way people carry things they are afraid to damage further. She stopped in the open doorway and looked at the sign above it, and then into the shop, and then at Miriam at the workbench. She asked with the particular uncertainty of someone who has rehearsed a question and is now not sure it applies, whether the shop was open. Miriam set down her loop. She looked at the clock in the young woman's hands, a Sessions anniversary movement, mid-century, the dome intact, the pendulum balls still on their suspension. She could see from where she sat that the suspension spring had snapped, which was the most common failure on that movement, and one she had not yet attempted but had read about twice in the handbook. She said yes. The shop was open. The young woman came inside, moving carefully on the worn floorboards, and set the clock on the counter and said it had been her grandmother's and that it had stopped working 2 years ago and she had not known where to take it. She reached into her jacket pocket and brought out $14 in folded bills and set them beside the clock. Miriam looked at the money. She looked at the clock. She worked the dome off its base and examined the movement with the loop and confirmed the broken suspension spring and checked the mainspring tension and found it adequate and looked at the pivot condition on the visible wheels and found them acceptable. The repair was a single part and perhaps an hour of careful work. She set the dome back on the base and slid both the clock and the $14 back across the counter toward the young woman. She told her to come back Thursday. The young woman looked at the money. Miriam said Thursday. And the young woman understood and put the money back in her pocket and said thank you and left. Thursday, she came back at 11 in the morning. The clock was on the counter, dome on, pendulum rotating in its slow measured arc, keeping time. The young woman picked it up and held it for a moment at eye level, watching the pendulum turn, and something shifted in her face that she did not put into words. She set it down and reached for her pocket. Miriam shook her head. The young woman started to speak. Miriam said it was an interesting movement and she had enjoyed the work. The young woman stood there for a moment, holding the clock, and then she nodded the way people nod when they are receiving something they do not quite know how to carry. She went out the door and down the gravel lane, and Miriam watched her go. She locked up at dusk. The key turned smoothly now. She had worked the lock with oil twice more since the first day, and it moved without resistance, the bolt drawing back cleanly and returning cleanly, doing what it was made to do. She stood outside for a moment on the stoop before pocketing the key. The birch trees were in full leaf, their small round leaves turning in a light evening air that smelled of cut grass and distant rain. The tin sign on its bracket had caught the last of the day's light and held it briefly, the letters readable in the slant illumination. Holt's Watch Repair. Esterborough, 1961. It hung at its slight angle, words running gently downhill. She had thought about straightening it. She had decided against it. Inside on the high shelf, the Seth Thomas clock ticked in the dark, small and steady, keeping time.